very interesting remarks, and I think perhaps we could take a couple of steps back and say something about capitalism. I mean, like Jesse, I think capitalism is clearly, even if you're kind of, well, actually, even Marxists really agree with capitalism. They just want the products of it to be distributed differently. So largely, everybody's agreed that capitalism is a great motive force for human good. The point I want to say is we've had varieties of capitalism. There's lots of different ways to own and trade. And I think that we can clearly see that some aspects of the development of the type of global capitalism that we've got now are highly problematic. Let me just give you one statistic that I think shows this very clearly. In 1974, the top 1% of US families owned 9% of US GDP. In 2007, the top 1% of US families owned 23.5% of US GDP. That's problematic. Because what's actually happening is the form of capitalism that we've tended to follow in the West has actually allowed fewer and fewer people to capture more and more of the cake. And it's become a form of what Jesse calls crony capitalism, what I and other parts call the problem of oligopoly or even monopoly. We've allowed massive capture of wealth, assets, and innovation by fewer and fewer people. Now the trouble is since I believe in capitalism, I believe in markets, what you happen when you start to restrict ownership, which is what we've done, and if you start to restrict access to markets, which is what we've done, you don't get what capitalism promises. And if we look at the market restriction, just look at UK, look at what's happened for what counts as a competitive market. 10, 15, 20 years ago, you had many markets. There were even 10 firms competing, even 12, even 15. Now the permissible model for free markets has fallen in jurisprudence to just 3 firms. And one of those firms can even have a 70% market share. And we call that competition. So what's actually happened is lots of the rhetoric of free markets has actually generated the exact opposite. They're not really free at all. And in fact, they become rent-seeking entities. And what we've now got in far too many sectors, not all, but far too many, is we've got rent-seeking vested interest that got there under the wrong version of free market theory. And I won't go into it because I don't have the time, but what we've got is an inversion of Hayek through people like Milton Friedman, and who weren't able to recognise the problem, and essentially we created markets that aren't really markets at all. Now, in one sense, and I'm not interested in penalising success, I want the successful to be more successful, because I think if the good is successful, everyone benefits. But what happens if the bad is successful, which I would argue has happened far too often in our society? What happens if the bad is successful? Is that essentially good behaviour or good capitalism is crowded out. And I think we've got a crowding out problem now in our society and our economy. That the wrong form of capitalism, the wrong form of economic exchange, essentially mitigates against other people doing well. And because I believe in free markets, I want them to be really free. And I believe in ownership, and I think Linda's point about property rights is well made. One of the problems, and we all know this because you've all read the books, one of the problems with countries moving from agrarian backgrounds to modern backgrounds is they don't have property rights. And what actually happens is custom dictates the most powerful in those societies seize vast tracts of land, vast tracts of ownership. So they own everything, and they then convert everyone else to a serf. Now, if you reread The Road to Serfdom, which I would suggest to you, I think we're now following a new form of capitalism that's converting far too many of us into serfs. And one way of tracking that is tracking asset ownership. And so this isn't just a problem in the third world, it's a problem in the first. Remember the quote I just gave. But if you take out property in the UK, 50% of the population, again in 1974, used to own 12% of the liquid wealth. 2007, 1%. And that's in this country. So we're practicing a form of capitalism that is decapitalising our people. All the while talking the rhetoric of ownership, all the while talking the rhetoric of markets. And what's doing that? It's not the nasty collective state, it's the market. And we're creating market mechanisms that essentially serve rent. And that's what bothers me. So what I want to suggest is we actually genuinely do need a new form of capitalism. We know in human history there's many different forms, some successful, some less successful. And I think that what I'd also like to point out is there's a very problematic relationship between capitalism and welfare. I'm in favour of low taxes. But if I want a low tax economy, I need a society that doesn't need welfare to the extent that we need welfare now. Now the trouble is, if we follow a form of capitalism that actually robs people of self-sufficiency, independence, access to market, ability to trade, and break through, we of necessity create the conditions for mass welfare. Now we know, for instance, that this is a real problem because returns to labour as a proportion of GDP have been falling since 1968. Now if you do a graph of the rise of US GDP, again, let's say from the mid-70s, to now, it's roughly more than doubled. But if you take if you take male workers, all male workers, it's fallen. If you take median wages, it's stagnated. And if you take women workers, it's risen and then plateaued. So if wages no longer deliver, and if most people are on wages and they don't actually own assets, what happens? Well, welfare rises. And again, looking at the US, in the 70s, about a quarter of the US population were relying on welfare payments and entitlements. But now it's over 50%. So, there's something problematic here. Because we're now creating not only a society that makes serfs of the poor, we're kind of used to that, we're kind of comfortable with that, I'm not, but I think our society is, we're increasingly going to make serfs of the middle class as well. So this whole model is unsustainable. And it's unsustainable because we can't afford to finance those welfare models anymore. We're simply not productive enough. Our model that is remaking serfdom, recreating serfdom, can no longer deliver the productivity and innovation gains that we need. Why? Because we've got a rent-seeking economy. And a rent-seeking economy won't innovate because nobody's got the interest to. It will just break vested interest. So what do we do? And I think this is where it's relevant for the third world. Though I don't like that term at all. No, I think in a way it's a bit like the word like the poor. I don't like the word the poor, but it resonates and people understand it. Pointless to use a word that people don't understand what you're referring to, but it is difficult. So what are we to do? Well, quite simply, we have to practice a different form of capitalism. One that Adam Smith promised, but that far too little free market economics has delivered on. What would that be? Well, let's think. I think, first of all, again, as Jesse said, it would involve that the act of exchange creates assets for both sides. The act of exchange is asset generating. So we no longer should have businesses that rely solely on wages and generation of wages. Generation of wages as the only thing that you give to people is no longer sufficient. Now, I'm not saying that not everything can be a cooperative, and it should be a cooperative. That would be the wrong model. But the idea of reciprocity or mutuality, or the idea that I think is the real origin of economics, which is mutually beneficial exchange, still remains relevant. What else then can companies give? Well, they can generate educational capacity. They can generate the type of social and technical skills and education that people need to move up the value chain and get a better and greater return for their labour. I think always companies should think about generating assets not just for the workers, but for everyone around them. And I strongly agree with the point on taxation. And if you don't agree with the point on taxation, think on this. Virtually every small and medium-sized enterprise pays its taxes and pays its taxes at extraordinarily high levels. Very few multinationals pay their taxes at anything like levels one can anticipate. GE, I think, paid 1% taxation. Barclays, I think, virtually nothing. The point is how can small and medium-sized enterprises compete when the big businesses that have all the advantages of scale aren't even paying the 30 or 40% tax that, in effect, small businesses are paying? That's why we've created, for instance, in Britain, an hourglass economy. Something like 78% of all British businesses are just sole traders. We've squeezed the middle. not just in terms of income, but in terms of businesses that can and should grow to scale. So if we're not going to do this in developing parts of the world, how can we do something differently? Well, let's talk about principles. Let's talk about that principle of reciprocity, of generating other goods other than simply wages. And that's what the big society really is. That's moving beyond CSR. And I think sort of what I liked in the Prime Minister's speech, and he said it himself, is that you can no longer as a business do bad capitalism, then come up with some form of sticking plaster for the consequences you have generated. Your original profit-making activity, and I believe in profit, I believe in ownership, your original profit-making activity must be good. And if it's good and already, as Jesse says, prices in the externalities, then the good that you do will be on top of the good you already do. And what I think we need to talk about systemically, almost as a globe, is what is it to crowd in good behaviour? And we all know that if the principle of reciprocity is operative, yes, mutuals, yes, co-ops, but co-ops and mutuals haven't gone to scale in the globe. Why not? And one of the reasons is, and I wrote about this in the Financial Times vis-a-vis the British situation in January, is we lack the company vehicle that can deliver this sort of mutuality. We lack a hybrid model where you can have a proportion of company return that goes to workers, and it can be in shares, it can be assets, it can be in education, I don't really care. It can be in pensions, it can be in anything you want. Coupled with a decent private sector return that international capital needs. Now, if we can create these hybrid models, and it doesn't matter how they do them, I mean, what's interesting, Circle Healthcare, which kind of should be welcomed by the left because it actually gives workers and nurses and doctors more power than they've ever had, is denigrated because it's actually a form of employee ownership, but it gives something like 49% of the return to the people in the business themselves and generates a private sector return. Now, why does that work? Well, we know that employee-owned companies outcompete the FTSE 100 by over 10% a year each and every year. That's the productivity gain that comes from ownership and incentives. Now, as I said, not everything could or should be a cooperative, and there are many ways we can think reciprocity. You think about your own family, your own background, people who give gifts to you, they can be multiple. The point is that's the model of capitalism we need to follow. And unless we can develop that, and people at Harvard are talking about shared value, there are many ways, I met most people who win the Nobel Prize lately, of always talking about forms of trust and of networks. I was at the Warwick Economics Summit, and I think it was Akerlof who won the Nobel Prize for used car sales. And he said, on the basis of rationality, nobody would ever buy a used car ever. Because actually, on optimal calculations, you will always get, and this is a technical word, screwed. But it's precisely because people trust that there is a market in used cars. So the idea that things like trust and ethics and reciprocity are somehow external to the market mechanism is completely false. They're absolutely necessary in order for the process of exchange to take place. So if we can stop talking about economics as if it's separate from morality, from ethics, from goodness, and actually realise it's fundamental to the working of economics. And if we can start talking about different levels of reciprocity, then we can start to have a form of capitalism that really does deliver all the goods that we all recognise. And that is why I think the big society narrative, and I don't care if you call it the big society, the good society, I don't care what you call it, but the merits of this position are so clear that if we can get this to be the new norm, then that really could change everything. Thank you.